It was a December night in Austin, cold enough that the breath fogged in the glow of strip mall lights, the kind of night where teenagers cluster under fluorescent hum to trade jokes and earn a little cash. I mean, the city was quieter then, smaller, and that corner on West Anderson Lane felt ordinary. On December 6th, 1991, 4 girls, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Lee Harbison, Sarah Louise Harbison, and 13-year-old Amy Ayers, were at the yogurt shop just doing what so many teens did, closing shifts, counting till, waiting for rides home. The ordinary turned into something else that night, and the city, you could say, stopped breathing.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate how that ordinary to horrific swing changes a community's sense of safety. Forensic and psychological responses to violence assume a baseline of predictability. When that baseline is shattered, especially by a crime that feels random, the ripple effects are profound. The yogurt shop case is one of those ripples that spread for decades, not just because of the crime itself, but because of how the investigation unfolded.
By the way, Caleb, let's ground listeners in the scene. It was a tiny, I can't believe it's yogurt shop in a strip center near North Cross Mall. Fluorescent lights, little tables, a toppings bar. Familiar, banal, the kind of place teens hung out. Around midnight, a motorcycle patrolman saw flames and radios it in. Firefighters arrived to what one investigator later called wholesale carnage. The fire was meant to erase evidence, and yet it couldn't erase the bodies or the questions.
Right, Mara. The scene was a catastrophic intersection of arson, violent sexual assault, and execution-style murder. The 4 girls were bound, gagged, stripped, shot in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. Amy also shot with a .380, and the shop was set on fire. The arson destroyed a lot of forensic trace, and the initial firefighting and emergency response, as necessary as it was, further compromised evidence preservation. Those are the basic, immutable facts we have to hold in mind.
I keep thinking about who these girls were. Eliza, 17, responsible and proud to have a job. Jennifer, 17, outgoing and animal-loving. Sarah, 15, quieter and adoring her sister. Amy, 13, bright and energetic. They were at that hinge between childhood and adulthood. Paychecks, sleepovers, mall trips. They were literally being teens. That makes the violence feel even worse. It takes away futures.
And from a forensic psychological view, that developmental stage matters to motive and to vulnerability. Predators often target people in transition, teens who are less guarded, who may grant trust more readily. The brutality here, binding, gagging, group control, suggests predators' intent on absolute control and domination, not a robbery in the traditional sense. The fact that the attackers used 2 different caliber weapons and set a fire hints at planning and an attempt to annihilate evidence and possibly people's ability to remember details.
Let's walk listeners through that last ordinary Friday night. Jennifer and Eliza were working the evening shift, doing closing tasks, mopping, counting the till, throwing out the trash. Sarah and Amy had spent the day at North Cross Mall, then came to the shop to catch a ride home with Jennifer. Chairs pushed up, lights flicked off, little rituals. Somewhere between closing and 11:45 p.m., something catastrophic happened.
Witness reports that night add to the timeline and to the mystery. 2 men were seen sitting at a table earlier, and an unknown man reportedly used the restroom in the back about an hour before closing. Investigators later suggested that person might have jammed the back door, potentially facilitating later entry. Those witnesses became central to the investigation, either as crucial leads or misleading, ambiguous memories that confounded detectives.
2 men at a table, the restroom man. They've haunted this case for years. Some witnesses swore the 2 men acted furtively or argued. Others thought nothing of them. They were never definitively identified, and even in later TV pieces like 48 Hours, they loom like ghosts. It's the kind of detail that spins stories for decades.
And that ambiguity is a nightmare for investigators.
Eyewitness memory, especially in dim strip mall lighting and hours after a traumatic event, is notoriously unreliable. But those sketchable, nameless figures became a focal point. Were they customers, accomplices, or red herrings? For decades, answers were elusive.
Okay, so the discovery: firefighters knock down the blaze and find a soggy, blackened shell. 3 bodies stacked in the back room, charred almost beyond recognition. A 4th, Amy, found closer to the front, with less charring but severe burns and 2 gunshot wounds. They were nude, bound with their own clothing, gagged, and executed. It was beyond brutal.
Yes, the use of victims' clothing as ligatures, the stripping, the headshots, those are hallmarks of an assault intended to dehumanize and obliterate agency. And then the fire on top of that, either to destroy evidence or as an additional act of domination and erasure. For investigators, the fire complicated every line of inquiry. Fingerprints, fibers, trace DNA, many of these were degraded or lost.
In the weeks after, the city responded like a place wounded. Over 1,000 tips poured into APD. National media camped out. Pressure mounted on detectives and prosecutors to find someone, anyone who could be held responsible. That pressure, we now know, shaped the direction of the investigation in dangerous ways.
Exactly. High-profile crimes create a climate where arrests are politically urgent. That urgency can skew judgment. Detectives may hone in on convenient suspects, interpret ambiguous statements as confessions, and deprioritize alternative lines of inquiry. In this case, you see that pattern: confessions, recantations, and later DNA that didn't match the suspects.
Let's talk about those suspects. In 1999, 4 local men were arrested, or linked: Robert Burns Springsteen IV, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. Springsteen and Scott eventually confessed in ways that prosecutors leaned on, confessions that would later be central to convictions. But the physical evidence, it didn't match. No fingerprints tied them to the scene, and the DNA recovered from the victims excluded them. That discrepancy was the seed of later upheaval.
The reliance on written confessions, some of which were not fully recorded in real time, raises red flags. Later, Springsteen and Scott recanted, describing lengthy, coercive interrogations. Psychological coercion, sleep deprivation, suggestive questioning, implied threats, can produce detailed false confessions. And when those confessions don't align with forensic facts, like the male DNA profile that excludes them, the doubt grows.
There's an image I can't get out of my head. 2 convictions based mainly on confessions, minimal physical evidence, and a male DNA profile sitting in a lab that doesn't match. Springsteen was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in 2001. Michael Scott was convicted later and got life. But the DNA didn't match either of them. That should have been a flashing neon sign.
It was a neon sign that took time to illuminate. Early 2000s DNA technology was more limited. The profile they had was male and didn't match the defendants, but prosecutors suggested it could represent an unidentified 5th man or a prior sexual contact unrelated to the murders. Defense teams argued the inverse. If the DNA points to someone else, why are these men guilty? That unresolved tension haunted appeals.
And then the legal wheels turned. Springsteen's conviction was overturned in 2006 by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals because of Sixth Amendment issues, specifically the admission of Scott's statements in a way that Springsteen couldn't confront. Similar problems undermined Scott's conviction later. Appeals focused not just on confession reliability, but on constitutional rights being trampled in the push to secure convictions.
Right. Procedural errors matter. The use of co-defendant statements can violate confrontation rights if a defendant can't cross-examine the declarant. That legal safeguard exists because out-of-court confessions can be unreliable and prejudicial. When courts recognized these violations, convictions had to be revisited, and the state was forced to reckon with its evidentiary weaknesses.
Fast forward to 2009, more advanced DNA testing, STR and YSTR techniques, confirmed that the male DNA didn't match Springsteen, Scott, Wellborn, or Pierce. The Travis County DA's office eventually dropped charges rather than retrying the men, and Springsteen and Scott were released. They walked out of prison, but not into clean records. They remained marked by those years.
Their release wasn't exoneration in the legal sense, and that ambiguity is part of the cruelty of wrongful conviction narratives. Years of lost time, reputational damage, family strain, that doesn't undo easily. And for the victims' families, the shifting sands, from case solved to case unresolved, produced its own whiplash. The DNA that excluded the convicted men didn't, however, identify the true perpetrator at that time.
That DNA sat in cold storage, quiet and potent, until forensic advances in the 2020s. Here's the late twist. In 2025, Austin PD, using modern DNA methods and genetic genealogy, linked the YSTR profile and a shell casing to Robert Eugene Brashers, a man already connected to rapes and murders in Missouri, South Carolina, and Tennessee. Brashers died by suicide in 1999 after a standoff. APD and prosecutors publicly stated that all evidence leads to Brashers as the likely perpetrator. That announcement shifted the narrative again.
Yes, the 2025 development reframes the case. Genetic genealogy and refined YSTR analysis can trace male lineage and sometimes produce familial leads that were impossible 2 decades earlier. Brasher's known pattern, attacks on women and girls, use of firearms, attempts to destroy evidence, made the match plausible to investigators. But the match also leaves unanswered questions. Was Brashers the only actor? Did he have accomplices?
Exactly, Caleb. Even with Brashers identified, there are threads that remain loose. The scene suggested more than one perpetrator. 2 different caliber weapons, the level of control over 4 victims, the logistics of binding and arson. Many profilers think more than one person would be needed to accomplish that. So even if Brashers was there, who helped him? Were the 2 men at a table witnesses to him? Were they with him? Or unrelated? The sketch, decades old, still stares back at us.
And we must be cautious. YSTR matches can indicate a male lineage rather than a single unique individual because Y chromosome profiles are shared along paternal lines. Genetic genealogy improves specificity, but you still have to account for false leads. In cold cases where a prime suspect is deceased, we lose the opportunity for interrogation and cross-examination that might reveal accomplices or sequence of events. So for families, identification is not always synonymous with comprehensive closure.
There's also the matter of the 2 never-identified customers that CBS highlighted. For decades, they were either suspects or innocent bystanders in the public imagination. With Brashers named, it's still unclear whether one of them was him, someone accompanying him, or someone who simply left a snapshot of ordinary teenage life. That unresolved, human detail, 2 young men laughing at a table, casts such a long shadow.
Human memory constructs narratives to fill gaps, and society often wants simple stories. One villain, one trial, neat closure. Reality rarely cooperates. The evidence in this case is fractured, destroyed in part by fire, contaminated in part by necessary emergency response, and obfuscated in part by investigative missteps. Those fractures create spaces where uncertainty and injustice can persist for years.
Let's be specific about investigative failures. The crime scene was chaotic, hundreds of tips pouring in, media pressure. Video shows detectives, journalists, and firefighters moving in and out of the tiny shop. Evidence contamination was a real risk. Then, months, years later, the focus on teen suspects, heavy reliance on confessions, and lack of physical linkage to the scene created an unstable tower that eventually toppled. It's a textbook case of how pressure can warp the search for truth.
And there's a human cost beyond the legal records, families suffering. Some family members initially believed the convictions brought justice, then DNA contradicted that narrative and reopened grief. Others never trusted the convictions and fought for continued investigation. Sarah Thomas Eliza's sister, said learning about the Brashers' DNA match eases her suffering. Yet she also recognizes it can't restore Eliza. That bittersweet relief is common when a likely perpetrator is identified posthumously.
Right. Apologies followed in 2025. The Travis County DA publicly apologized to the initial teen suspects for the years they lived under suspicion or incarcerated. But what does an apology fix? It can't give back decades. It can't wipe away the stigma or the trauma. Still, it's a recognition by the system that things went wrong, an important, if insufficient, step.
It's also worth noting the modern forensic arc. In 1991, DNA technology was embryonic compared to today. Back then, labs might only get partial profiles, and databases were tiny. Over the last 30 years, STR, YSTR testing, genetic genealogy, and even ballistic comparison networks grew more sophisticated, enabling matches that were impossible in 1991. The yogurt shop case became a test case for how technology can rewrite narratives, sometimes decades later.
We should talk about Robert Eugene Brashers in the way the source material allows. He was a serial offender linked posthumously to rapes and murders in several states, and his pattern included attacks on women and girls, use of firearms, and sometimes arson or attempts to destroy evidence. He died by suicide in 1999 during a police standoff. Those are the facts investigators released when they announced the YSTR match in 2025. But, important, he's dead, so there's no public trial to vet those claims in court.
And without a trial, certain avenues remain closed. Cross-examination can reveal inconsistent statements, motives, and accomplices. The family and the public have to rely on the integrity of laboratory work, chain of custody records, and prosecutorial transparency, which ideally are there, but skepticism is understandable given prior investigative errors. Independent review and clear forensic documentation help build confidence, but they cannot replicate a courtroom airing.
Let's bring it back to the victims for a moment. The city changes, strip malls demolished, tenants swapped, but there's a memorial at the old site where friends and family gather each December 6th to say the 4 names. Saying names matters. It's a way of refusing to let them become just a case file or a sensational segment on a true crime show. It keeps the focus where it should be, on human lives lost.
Naming is resistance against anonymity. In forensic psychology, we talk about narrative restitution, giving victims a coherent story within social memory. Even if scientific identification closes a forensic loop, narrative restitution, honoring the girls' lives, acknowledging investigative failures, and supporting families remains crucial for communal healing. And it's precisely what victim-centered storytelling aims to do.
We also need to ask, was Brashers alone? If he wasn't, who else is out there? The scene's logistics point to the possibility of accomplices, multiple guns, binding 4 victims, setting a fire. That kind of operation, many experts say, often involves more than one person. The identification of Brashers answers one question and multiplies others.
Yes, and DNA alone can't reconstruct the choreography of that night. The sequence of assaults, who controlled whom, why Amy was separated from the others, whether the restroom man jammed the door earlier. Those are kinetic details best pieced together from testimony and physical traces, many of which were obliterated. So there's an inherent limit to what science can tell us, even at its most advanced.
There's also the question of accountability for investigative mistakes. Why were alternative suspects and profiles not pursued more aggressively? How much did public pressure and the political need for an arrest drive detectives toward the teens? Those are uncomfortable questions for agencies, but they have to be asked. Otherwise, the same patterns repeat.
Institutional lessons are crucial. Training on interrogation techniques, stricter evidence preservation protocols, better documentation, and trauma-informed victim interaction can guard against recurrence. The yogurt shop case shows how high stakes and low forensic clarity create fertile ground for errors. Reform isn't just moral, it's practical.
By the way, people ask us sometimes, after the 2025 match, did the DA declare the case closed? The answer is complicated. Law enforcement publicly named Brashers and said evidence points to him. But because he's dead, and because many questions about accomplices and sequence remain, the narrative is more likely solved than fully resolved. The case remains, in many ways, still unanswered.
And that phrasing matters, Mara. Solved in a forensic sense might mean a DNA match ties a person to a crime scene. Resolved in a social and legal sense requires explanation, accountability, and often a trial. For families, closure is less about labels and more about the emotional arc, knowing who, why, how. When the central actor is deceased, those arcs are truncated.
So what does justice look like now? For the families, it's messy. Some feel relief. Sonora said she once thought she'd die without knowing, and the match eases her suffering. Others feel a hollow victory because no one will stand in court to be cross-examined. For the wrongfully accused men, an apology doesn't give back years. For the city, the memory remains a burn mark.
There's an ethical question about how we as storytellers and listeners consume these stories. Do we sensationalize the horror, or do we center victims and systemic lessons? True crime can raise public awareness and even spur resources for cold cases, but it can also re-traumatize families or reduce lived experiences to plot points. Responsible storytelling means holding victims' dignity at the center.
That's the mission of Still Unanswered. We say their names, we tell the facts, and we stay with the questions that remain, because sometimes silence is falsely comforting. There's a difference between a case listed as closed and a wound being healed. Listeners, if you take anything away, let it be this. Identifying a probable perpetrator is important, but it isn't the end of the moral work.
And in practical terms, there's a call to action. Fund cold case units, support advanced forensic testing, and push for interrogation reforms that guard against false confessions. Cases like this show the long tail of consequence when the system makes mistakes. Prevention and accountability are two sides of the same coin.
Let's pause and reflect. I want to ask you, Caleb, given everything we know from the source material, what weighs heaviest on you as a wrongful conviction researcher? What's the sting that lingers?
I think the sting is twofold. First, the human damage. 4 girls' lives taken and families left in a decades-long limbo. Second, the institutional damage. When a system that should protect makes mistakes, it not only harms individuals, but corrodes public trust. The yogurt shop case is a concentrated example of both. Even now, with Brasher's identification, those institutional lessons should be front and center.
Yeah. You know, sometimes people ask why we keep revisiting a case like this. They say, it's been solved, let it rest. But the answer is simple. The story never really stopped breathing for those families, and neither did the questions. Saying their names keeps the memory alive and keeps the pressure on institutions to do better.
And from my perspective, revisiting plays a preventative role. Public scrutiny incentivizes reform. When the public sees the consequences, wrongful convictions, bungled investigations, they're more likely to support policy changes. Recording interrogations, preserving evidence properly, expanding DNA databases ethically, and investing in cold case units. These are tangible outcomes of narrative work.
One more thing before we wrap.
The cultural context. Early 90s Austin felt different, smaller, maybe more insulated. The yogurt shop murders are often marked as the moment Austin's innocence was punctured. That's not just nostalgia, it's an important civic memory. Towns change, but they also carry scars.
Memory shapes policy too. Cities that experience horrific crimes sometimes overcorrect with punitive measures or hasty prosecutions. The better path is one that balances urgency with rigor. Forensic technology helps, but institutional humility and procedural safeguards are what prevent tragedies from being compounded by injustice.
We're almost out of time. Before we go, the unanswered threads I'm holding on to are fourfold. Were there accomplices? What's the minute-by-minute chronology? Why did investigative tunnel vision happen as it did? And what does justice truly mean now? Those are the things I'll keep saying until they're answered. Or until we accept that some answers will remain partial.
And I'll add a fifth. How do communities reckon with both the facts of a case and the failures of an investigation? That reckoning is part of restorative justice, and it requires listening, policy change, and reparative steps for both victims and the wrongfully accused. It's uncomfortable, but necessary.
Listeners, if you want to read more, we've linked the reporting and archival sources in the episode notes. The Austin Chronicles deep dive, the CBS 48 Hours coverage on the two men at the table, the 2009 DNA updates, and the 2025 announcements about Robert Eugene Brasher's. We used those pieces as our factual map tonight. Please, if you're moved, consider supporting organizations that fund cold case work and victim support services.
And if you're a policymaker or a prosecutor listening, mandate recorded interrogations, invest in evidence preservation, and put resources into victim-centered approaches. The technical tools exist to prevent some of the worst errors we've seen. Use them.
We end where we began, with names. Eliza Hope Thomas, Jennifer Lee Harbison, Sarah Louise Harbison, Amy Ayers. Say them out loud. Keep them in mind. These were real lives, unfinished stories that shaped a city and taught bitter lessons about how we seek truth.
Say them, and then ask the next question. Who else needs to be found? Who else needs recognition for the harm done? Who will carry forward the reforms that make other families not endure what these families did? Those are the practical next steps.
Thank you, Caleb. And thank you, listeners, for sitting with us. We'll be back next week with another case that won't let a city sleep. Until then, I'm Mara Ellison.
And I'm Dr. Caleb Rios. Stay curious and stay compassionate.